When you look at the sacrifices of Cain and Abel, why was Abel's sacrifice accepted by God and Cain's was not? Was it because Cain's sacrifice was from the land? We read about the sacrifices of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. So go ahead and turn your Bible to Genesis chapter 4. As you might expect, there's not really a short answer to this question. There's some nuance. There's some careful speculation that we can do, and I think it is very easy to take speculation too far with a question like this. So let's start by reading what the Bible actually says in Genesis chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 1 through 8. It says, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him." Now the account goes on from there to talk about Cain's punishment for his reaction to being confronted. That is to say, his response to being told you could do better was to kill Abel and not to do better. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if we continue reading in Genesis chapter 4, I don't think it provides any more insight into why Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's was not. From this reading, we don't see any instructions from God to them about what they were supposed to do. It doesn't say God asked them to give a sacrifice like ABC, and Abel did it and Cain did not. We don't even see God saying, please make sacrifices. And so we maybe don't have the full picture, or maybe we do. It's hard to say. We do know from later instructions that God gives to the Israelites in the law of Moses that he is very particular about how he wants them to worship him, including through sacrifices. And while he calls for animal sacrifices, and we read and perhaps think the most about those animal sacrifices, he does also ask for grain and for drink offerings. And so we might be inclined to look at Genesis chapter 4 and say, well, Cain gave from the fruit of the ground, and that's why his sacrifice was not acceptable. But we can't use the law of Moses to try to interpret what was going on with Cain and Abel. And we, frankly, just don't have a lot of information about what was expected of them, except we know how God reacted to that. I looked across many different English translations, and it looks like from what we can see, or what I can see from those English translations, Cain's offering was of the fruit of the ground, and there's nothing in the Hebrew text to say that the produce that he brought was anything particularly special, but we contrast that with Abel, who is said to have brought the firstborn animals and the best of them at that, whether that was the fat portion of the firstborn or the firstborn and the fat portion is perhaps a little bit unclear, but what we can see different between Cain and Abel is that Abel was definitely bringing the best that he possibly could, and the language does not indicate that Cain did that. We've looked in Genesis chapter 4. That's where we read about the event happening, but there are other places throughout the Bible that refer back to this and can actually give us some additional insight as well. I did not see any references to it anywhere else in the Old Testament, but there are a few in the New. Most of them that are referring to Cain and Abel are talking about Abel and his blood being exceptional in some way. Essentially, I think this is because he was the first martyr. He was killed for being righteous, for doing what God wanted him to do. And we can read, through Revelation and through other accounts that God has regard for people who are faithful unto death. We also read about it in Jude and verse 11, but that doesn't give us a whole lot of insight into the situation. So let's go to 1 John chapter 3. I think we can learn a little bit from what we read in 1 John chapter 3. First John chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. It says, "For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised then that the world hates you." John isn't trying to teach us about Cain and Abel in this situation. He's referring to what we already understand about them. And again, most of this is talking about Cain's response to that, but it says that he murdered his brother because his own deeds were evil. Something about Cain's sacrifice, John here characterizes as evil, and Abel's sacrifice as righteous. That implies, at least to me, that God had given instructions and Cain did not follow them. Otherwise, how could it be considered evil? And one final passage we'll look at is in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. "By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks." This passage, I think, provides the most insight into what was going on with Cain and Abel. I think that it shows that Abel gave his sacrifice by faith. That's what motivated his sacrifice. That's what motivated the particulars of it. It is perhaps the fact that it was motivated by faith that made it more acceptable or made it righteous. Again, that's a little bit of speculation there. Nothing about that is quite explicit anywhere in the text that I could find. The Bible is not perfectly clear about why Abel's sacrifice was more acceptable, but I think we can conclude that Abel's sacrifice was motivated by faith and demonstrated faith, in that giving up the firstborn animal is significant. What if there's not a second? I mean, he is betting against his own future by giving up his best and his first. And I think that Abel is showing faith. He's demonstrating faith by doing that because he's sort of tacitly saying, I believe that God is going to be able to do better, that this is better for me to give this to God than to keep it for myself. We can demonstrate faith like Abel when we use our time and our resources without thinking about how it might impact our future. We need to be willing to give, willing to do what we are called to do, and to give of our best. And when we're doing that, we're showing faith like Abel, and we can trust that our righteous actions will be acceptable to God if they are motivated by faith and follow the instructions that we see. That's maybe not a thorough or satisfying answer to the question, but I think that's the best we can do, unless you guys have something to add to that.
No, I was glad to see that you went to Hebrews 11. That's the first place I turned, expecting that you would eventually get there, and you did. Yeah, the fact that God calls his sacrifice and his character as the sacrificer, as righteous, God testified of that, it says in Hebrews 11. And so from God's own mouth, we have affirmed to us, because he obviously makes the distinction in Genesis too. But yeah, it's important for us to realize that God said it was more. We can try and figure out what it is, but ultimately it all comes back to that faith. And I think, like you said, the importance of first fruits.